Imagine this. You are standing at the edge of a world locked beneath ice. A bitter wind slices across your face like countless tiny blades. Every breath turns into a cloud of white mist before disappearing into the frozen air. Before you stretches a vast plain, so immense that the horizon seems to dissolve into the silver-gray sky. There are no cities, no roads, no signposts. Only ice, grass, stone, and endless open space. You have no map, no compass, no language with which to describe something called a continent, in fact. You don't even know that somewhere ahead of you lies a vast landmass that tens of thousands of years later humanity will call America. The only thing you know is that winter is coming. The mammoths have already begun to move. The great bison are leaving the grasslands. The food around your camp is becoming scarcer with every passing day. If your family hopes to survive one more year, there is only one choice left. Keep walking. Every step seems completely ordinary. Cross another river. Climb another valley. Make your way over another hillside. No one in your group believes they are becoming explorers. No one imagines they are about to change the course of human history. No one tells the children, keep going. There's an entirely new continent waiting ahead. Because nobody knows it exists. And yet, tens of thousands of years later, as archaeologists unearthed stone tools buried deep beneath the earth, as geneticists decoded the DNA of ancient skeletons, and as geologists reconstructed the world of the Ice Age, they began to uncover an astonishing truth. Those seemingly aimless footsteps had carried humanity onto an entirely new continent, not because they intended to discover it, but because they never stopped walking. And that is what makes this one of the greatest mysteries in human history. How do you find a place when you don't even know it exists? Today, when we look at a world map, everything seems obvious. Asia, Europe, Africa, America. Those familiar borders make it feel as though the continents have always existed as separate worlds, and that humans understood the shape of the Earth from the very beginning. But the reality was completely different. For people who lived more than 20,000 years ago, the very concept of a continent simply did not exist. They didn't divide the world into enormous landmasses painted different colors on a map. They divided it in a very different way, where fresh water could be found, where the animals gathered, where wild berries grew, where winters were less brutal, where children had the greatest chance of surviving. Their world was not defined by geography. It was defined by survival. And that one small difference would ultimately change the entire course of human history. Today, we often ask, who was the first person to discover America? But perhaps that is the wrong question from the very beginning. No king financed this journey. No expedition was commissioned to search for a new land. No ship sailed with maps pointing the way. No leader stood before a crowd and declared, "We are setting out to discover an unknown continent." Instead, there were only small families. Fathers, mothers, children, and countless decisions that seemed completely ordinary. Follow the herds. Find another source of water. Escape the coming winter. Protect the children. Each decision was made simply to survive one more season. But when thousands of generations made those same choices over and over again, those tiny footsteps became one of the greatest migrations in the history of our species. Scientists believe this journey was not a voyage that lasted months or even years. It unfolded over hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, across countless generations. No single individual ever witnessed the end of the journey. Each group simply responded to what lay directly before them: a changing climate, migrating herds, and the ever-growing demands of survival. Perhaps the most astonishing part is not that humans eventually reached America. It is that not a single one of them knew they were doing it. History usually celebrates people with grand visions: kings, navigators, inventors. But sometimes, humanity's greatest transformations do not begin with a master plan. They begin with a single step, then another, and another, till, one day, an entirely new continent lies behind them. But if all they were doing was walking, why did it take thousands of years? What held them back? What turned this journey into one of the harshest challenges humanity has ever faced? The answer does not lie with humans. It lies with the earth itself. Because the world those first people saw was nothing like the world we know today. And to understand how the first humans reached America without ever knowing it existed, we must first return to the moment when the Ice Age quietly reshaped an entire planet. Imagine this. One day, the water level of every ocean on Earth suddenly drops by more than 100 meters. The seas where ships sail today disappear. The seafloor becomes open plains. Scattered islands become connected to the mainland. Routes that never existed before suddenly emerge. It sounds like science fiction, but around 20,000 years ago, that was exactly the world our ancestors lived in. During the coldest period of the last ice age, an enormous amount of Earth's water was no longer contained within the oceans. Instead, it was locked inside colossal ice sheets covering North America, Northern Europe, and vast regions across the Northern Hemisphere. In some places, the ice was more than 3 kilometers thick, so heavy that it forced the land beneath it to sink under its immense weight. With so much water trapped as ice, global sea levels fell by more than 100 meters compared to today. That was no minor change. It was enough to expose millions of square kilometers of land that now lie beneath the sea. And at the eastern edge of Asia, something extraordinary happened. Between what is now Siberia and the U.S. state of Alaska, the ocean almost disappeared. In its place emerged an enormous plain, stretching for thousands of kilometers. Today, scientists call this land Beringia. But to the people who lived there, it was simply another part of the world. There was no sea dividing one land from another. No marker announcing, "You are about to leave Asia." No sign reading, "Welcome to North America." Because in their minds, there was only land. Land leading to more land. Grassland giving way to more grassland. And the horizon forever waiting ahead. That is what makes this story so remarkable. Today, when we look at a map, it seems almost impossible to imagine walking from Asia to America. Between the two continents lies the sea, the icy Bering Strait, powerful ocean currents. But the first humans never saw that map. Nor did they know that tens of thousands of years later, rising seas would drown the very path they once traveled. To them, there was no ocean crossing at all. They were simply walking. Geological evidence shows that Beringia was not the narrow strip of land often depicted in simplified illustrations. It was an immense tundra-steppe ecosystem, in some places more than 1,000 kilometers wide. For thousands of years, it became one of the richest ecosystems of the Ice Age. If you had stood on Beringia during that time, you would not have seen a barren wasteland. You would have seen life. Woolly mammoths moving slowly across endless grasslands that stretched all the way to the horizon. Great herds of massive bison grazing in such numbers that the ground trembled beneath their footsteps. Wild horses racing across the frozen plains. Caribou following migration routes that had existed for thousands of years. Above them, endless flocks of migrating birds filled the sky. To human beings, it would have felt like an invitation. Because where there are animals, there is food. Where there is food, there is life. But this is also where we need to change the way we think about our ancestors. We often imagine them as explorers, people who deliberately chose their direction, made careful plans, set ambitious goals. The truth was probably the exact opposite. Anthropologists believe that most hunter-gatherer communities did not lead their journeys. They followed the rhythm of nature. The herds determined where they moved. The climate decided where they camped. Water sources dictated when they stopped. In other words, humans were not leading the way. Nature was. Think about that for a moment. If a herd of mammoths suddenly began moving north, what would you do? Would you stay behind, where food was rapidly disappearing? Or would you follow them? To us today, that sounds like a decision. To them, it was almost instinct. Not following the herds meant hunger. And hunger usually meant death. So season after season, year after year, they kept walking. Not to discover a new land, but to avoid losing the land that was already keeping them alive. And that created a remarkable paradox. They were never searching for America, yet every step they took in the footsteps of the herds brought them closer to it. However, if Beringia was such a vast and fertile land bridge, why didn't humans spread quickly throughout North America? What forced them to stop for such a long time? The answer lay just ahead, not on the ground, but within two colossal walls of ice, towering kilometers into the sky. That blocked nearly every path to the south. If Beringia truly connected Asia and North America, then why did it take thousands of years before humans spread deeper into the continent? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Just keep walking. But those two simple words, keep walking, conceal one of the greatest obstacles our ancestors ever faced. Imagine that you have just crossed an immense plain stretching for thousands of kilometers. Behind you lies the land your people have called home for generations. Ahead of you is an entirely new world. You think you're about to step into endless open country, but then you stop. Not because you've run out of food, not because you've lost your courage, but because standing before you is a wall of white stretching all the way to the horizon. Not a mountain, not a cliff, but an ocean of ice. During the peak of the last ice age, nearly all of northern North America was buried beneath two enormous ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet in the east and the Cordilleran ice sheet in the west. Don't imagine the glaciers we see in modern photographs. These ice sheets were almost beyond comprehension. Climate research shows that in many places, they were more than 3 kilometers thick, comparable to, or even taller than, many of today's highest mountain peaks. Their immense weight pressed the Earth's crust downward, reshaping the very continent beneath them. If you stood before them, you wouldn't see an ending. Only a colossal white wall stretching from east to west. No obvious passage. No trail. No opening wide enough for an entire community to cross. This was no longer merely an obstacle. It was another world. A world that was almost impossible for humans to survive in. Temperatures could fall low enough to numb exposed flesh within minutes. Blizzards carried snow and ice so fiercely that footprints disappeared almost as soon as they were made. Crevasses tens of meters deep lay hidden beneath thin layers of snow like invisible traps. Even sunlight became deceptive. The dazzling reflection from the ice was powerful enough to damage the eyes of anyone forced to stare at it for hours. Today, even with insulated clothing, satellite maps, and modern rescue equipment, traveling across glaciers remains extremely dangerous. Now imagine attempting the same journey, with nothing more than animal skin clothing, a handful of stone tools, and young children depending on you for survival. This was not an expedition. It was almost an impossible mission. That is why the story of the first people to reach America may not be the story of people who always kept moving forward. It may instead be the story of people who knew how to wait. This is one of the fascinating ideas that modern science has gradually brought to light. Anthropologists propose that some human communities may have lived in Beringia for an extraordinarily long time instead of immediately moving into North America. This idea is commonly known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. If that hypothesis is correct, it means that generation after generation of people were born, grew up, raised families, and eventually died on the land between two continents. They no longer fully belonged to Asia, yet they had not truly entered America either. They lived in a world suspended between two worlds, a place that was both the end of one journey and the beginning of another. That forces us to rethink one of our most familiar assumptions about history. We often imagine history being shaped by decisive moments, a battle, an invention, a great voyage. But sometimes, history is shaped by the long stretches of time when nothing seems to happen at all. Hundreds of years, thousands of years. People simply lived, hunted, raised their children, and waited. Not because they wanted to wait, but because nature had not yet allowed them to move on. It was a lesson our ancestors learned very early. Human beings may be intelligent, creative, resilient, but in the end, we still live according to the rhythm of the earth. No one can command the ice to melt. No one can force winter to end sooner. No one can order the climate to change. For tens of thousands of years, nature alone decided when a door would open and when it would close. Then one day, the climate began to change. The earth slowly grew warmer. The colossal walls of ice gradually started to retreat. But at that very moment, another question emerged. Did our ancestors really wait until the ice melted before entering the Americas? Or were there bolder groups who quietly discovered an entirely different route, not across the land, but along the shoreline of a frozen ocean? For decades, the story appeared to have a simple answer. Humans crossed Beringia. They waited for the ice to retreat. Then they traveled south through an ice-free corridor. Everything seemed perfectly logical. So logical, in fact, that for many years it was considered the definitive explanation. But then, archaeology began asking difficult questions. Some ancient sites in the Americas appeared to be older than the time when that so-called ice-free corridor was believed to have become wide enough for people to travel through. In other words, it seemed that humans had already reached lands south of the great ice sheets, before that route even existed. If that is true, how did they get there? This is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because instead of having a single answer, scientists were suddenly confronted with an entirely new mystery. If they couldn't pass through the ice, where did they go instead? One of the most widely discussed ideas today shifts our attention toward the ocean. At first, that sounds almost impossible. If the land itself was already brutally cold, wouldn't the sea have been even more dangerous? But sometimes, the most obvious answer isn't the right one. Today, when we look at the northern Pacific coastline, we see freezing waters, towering waves, and rugged cliffs. It's difficult to imagine prehistoric people surviving there. But the world 15 or 20,000 years ago was not exactly the same. Geological and ecological evidence suggests that a remarkably rich coastal ecosystem once stretched along the Pacific Rim. Scientists often refer to it as the Kelp Highway. Don't let the simple name fool you. This wasn't a highway paved with stone. It was a continuous chain of coastal environments where dense forests of kelp attracted fish, shellfish, seabirds, seals, sea otters, and countless other forms of marine life. In other words, it was a dinner table stretching for thousands of kilometers. For communities that had already learned how to harvest the sea, it wasn't a place to fear. It was a place filled with opportunity. Imagine an Ice Age morning along that coastline. A blanket of mist still hangs over the water. Gentle waves lap against rocky shores. Several adults spear fish in the shallow water. Children gather shellfish trapped in tide pools as the tide recedes. Others repair a simple boat built from wood, animal bones, and stretched hides. No one is crossing an ocean. No one is sailing into the endless sea. They simply move from one bay to another, from one river mouth to the next, from one island to another. Each journey covers only a few kilometers, close enough to keep the shoreline in sight, safe enough to turn back if the weather suddenly changes. One season passes, then another. One generation follows another, then many more. Little by little, the distance between Asia and America grows shorter, not because of one epic voyage, but because of thousands of very small ones. The remarkable part is, these people probably didn't need to become master sailors to accomplish this. They simply needed to do what our ancestors had always done best: adapt. Scientists believe humans had already developed simple watercraft long before this migration, even though direct evidence has largely disappeared because wood, hides, and cordage rarely survive for tens of thousands of years. However, humanity's early arrival on many islands throughout Southeast Asia and Oceania strongly suggests that people had mastered short water crossings long before they reached the far northern Pacific. That is a detail often overlooked. We tend to imagine the first Americans as hunters of the open plains, but perhaps some of them were also people of the sea. They understood the tides. They knew where seasonal fish would gather. They recognized when the morning fog would lift. They could read the winds that warned of approaching storms. None of this knowledge was written in books. None of it was carved into stone. It was passed from one generation to the next, through stories, through careful observation, through failure, and sometimes at an unbearable cost. Perhaps there were boats that never returned, families that vanished into the icy sea, warnings repeated around campfires for generations. But it was through those hard-earned experiences that humans slowly transformed a dangerous coastline into a pathway. That is also one of humanity's defining traits. We are not the fastest creatures. We are not the strongest. We are not the best swimmers. What truly sets us apart is our ability to transform knowledge into a tool for survival. An experience shared today can save the life of a child many generations from now. A mistake made today can become a lesson for an entire community. That is why, when we look back at humanity's migration into the Americas, we are not simply looking at footprints. We are looking at thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. Each generation learned a little more. understood a little more, traveled a little farther, till one day, an entirely new continent stood before them. But then, another question continued to trouble scientists. If people truly traveled along the coast, why have we found so few traces of them? Surely their campsites, their hearths, their stone tools should still be there. Or perhaps, did they disappear along with the very route our ancestors once traveled? Imagine this. You've just discovered a journal documenting the greatest journey in human history. But the moment you open it, you realize that nearly all of its most important pages have been torn away. That is almost exactly the challenge archaeologists face today. Every time they try to trace the footsteps of the first people who reached the Americas, they discover that a huge part of the story has vanished. Not because humans destroyed it, but because the Earth itself did. When the Ice Age came to an end, the global climate began to warm. The immense glaciers that had accumulated over tens of thousands of years slowly melted away. Tiny streams merged into rivers. Those rivers flowed into the sea, and over thousands of years, the oceans gradually rose. Not by a few centimeters, not by a few meters. Modern climate research shows that global sea levels have risen by more than 100 meters since the peak of the last ice age. That was enough to drown vast coastal plains all around the world. Now try to see the world through the eyes of someone who lived 20,000 years ago. The place where you pitched your camp might now lie beneath the ocean floor. The river where you collected fresh water could now be buried beneath dozens of meters of seawater. The beach where children once played may have disappeared entirely from the face of the earth. If the coastal migration hypothesis is correct, then much of the most important evidence has disappeared beneath the sea as well. It is an extraordinary paradox. We are searching for footprints on a road that no longer exists. Imagine an archaeologist living 10,000 years in the future. They want to uncover traces of today's coastal cities, but by then, every modern shoreline has disappeared beneath the ocean. Would they conclude that people in the 21st century never lived there? Or would they realize they were simply looking in the wrong place? That is the same puzzle scientists are trying to solve today. The absence of evidence does not always mean something never happened. Sometimes, it simply means the evidence lies somewhere incredibly difficult to reach. That is why modern archaeology is no longer confined to digging on land. Researchers now use survey vessels, sonar technology, seafloor mapping, and ancient sea level reconstructions to identify places that were once coastlines tens of thousands of years ago. It is like trying to assemble a giant puzzle, while more than half of the pieces still lie buried beneath the ocean. But then, the Earth slowly began giving back a few of those missing pieces. Across the Americas, archaeologists uncovered sites whose ages forced the scientific community to rethink long-held assumptions. Not because the discoveries were strange, but because they were older than expected. Archaeological evidence shows that several human occupation sites predate the Clovis first model that dominated archaeology for decades. This does not mean every new hypothesis has been proven correct, but it does suggest that the story of the first people to reach the Americas is far more complex than we once imagined. What makes this especially fascinating is that science does not move forward by defending a single answer. Science moves forward by daring to ask new questions. There was a time when many researchers believed the Clovis culture represented the very first people to arrive in the Americas. But as new discoveries emerged, that view gradually changed. Not because those earlier scientists lacked ability, but because they simply did not have the evidence we possess today. There is something profoundly meaningful about that. History itself never changes. What changes is our understanding of history. And perhaps, that is how humanity has always progressed. Not by always being right, but by being willing to revise what we once believed to be true. Even so, while archaeology can tell us where people lived, what tools they used, and what animals they hunted, there is still one question that stone tools and fossil footprints can never answer on their own. Who were these people? How were they related to one another? Were the people living in Siberia truly the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of the Americas? And how could we possibly know when none of them are still alive to tell their own story? The astonishing answer is, one witness has accompanied them throughout the entire journey. A witness that cannot speak, cannot write, yet has never forgotten a single step they took. That witness exists inside every one of our cells. DNA. If you could travel back in time, what would you ask the very first people who set foot in the Americas? Would you ask which route they followed? How long it took them to get there? What was the very first thing they saw when they entered this new land? Or perhaps you would simply ask, where did you come from? Sadly, there is no one left alive to answer. They left behind no journals. They carved no names into stone. They recorded none of their journeys in writing. For most of human history, stories survived only in memory. And memory is far more fragile than we often realize. A story can change after only a few generations. A legend can acquire new details. A memory can disappear forever when the last person who remembers it dies. If all we had were stories, we might never know who the first people to reach the Americas truly were. But nature preserved another record. Not inside books, not inside stone, but within the human body itself. DNA. Every time a child is born, it isn't only eye color or hair color that is passed down from their parents. A remarkably long history is passed on as well. Quietly, silently, from one generation to the next. Imagine DNA as a letter. Each generation copies that letter and hands it to the generation that follows. During the copying process, small mistakes occasionally appear. A single letter changes. A short section is added. Another section disappears. To most people, those tiny changes seem meaningless. But to geneticists, they are like accidental ink marks left behind on every copy. By following those marks, scientists can trace how these letters have been passed from one generation to another, and through which communities they have traveled. That is why DNA is often described as a time machine. It cannot tell us whom someone loved, what they feared, or what landscapes they once gazed upon. But it can reveal who shared common ancestors, which populations separated from one another, and where those journeys first began. Current genetic research indicates that the ancestors of indigenous peoples in the Americas were closely related to ancient populations that once lived across northeastern Asia and Siberia. Yet, the story is far more complicated than a simple migration from point A to point B. DNA evidence reveals multiple waves of separation, mixing, and migration unfolding over thousands of years. That completely transforms the way we imagine this migration. This was not a single line of people walking across a land bridge. It was hundreds of small communities. Some moved forward. Some stayed behind. Some split apart. Some met again and merged into one. Like tiny streams, they branch apart, flow back together, and continue onward, until eventually they form one great river. Perhaps human history works in exactly the same way, not as one straight line, but as countless paths weaving together. Even more fascinating, DNA also tells the story of an extraordinary period in time. Scientists believe the ancestors of indigenous Americans may have remained isolated in Beringia for many generations before expanding into the rest of the Americas. That period appears to have lasted long enough for distinctive genetic characteristics to develop before those communities eventually spread southward. Pause for a moment and think about that. There may once have been children born on Beringia, children who grew up across those frozen grasslands, married there, raised families there, and eventually died there. Throughout their entire lives, they never knew they were living at the crossroads of two continents. To them, it was simply home. Isn't that remarkable? Today, we think of Beringia as a bridge, but to the people who actually lived there, it was never a bridge. It was home. And that reminds us of something profoundly important. Modern people always look at history from the ending. We already know that America lies on the other side, so everything seems destined to lead there. But our ancestors never had that advantage. They didn't know they were moving in the right direction. They didn't know how long the journey would last. They didn't know whether food still waited ahead, or whether only ice and death lay beyond the horizon. They knew only one thing: tomorrow had to be survived. That is what makes this migration so extraordinary. Not because they knew they would succeed, but because they kept moving forward, even without a single guarantee. Perhaps that is the very quality that has defined our species for hundreds of thousands of years. We continue stepping into the future, without ever knowing exactly what awaits us. From the hunters of Beringia to astronauts leaving Earth itself, that spirit has never changed. But one final question still remains. If no one realized they were discovering an entirely new continent, what kept generation after generation of human beings from ever stopping their journey toward the horizon? Imagine one simple question. What would have happened if our ancestors had chosen to stop? If, one day, they looked toward the horizon and said, "This is far enough. We won't go any farther." Perhaps, you and I would not be here today to tell this story. Because the history of our species was never shaped by those who remained in one place. It was shaped by those willing to take one more step. Not because they knew what lay ahead, but because they could not survive by standing still. That is an enormous difference. Today, we often imagine great expeditions as the product of curiosity. People crossed oceans to discover, climbed mountains to conquer, journeyed into space in search of knowledge. But tens of thousands of years ago, the greatest motivation was not discovery, it was survival. A herd of caribou changes its migration route. A summer becomes shorter than usual. A river dries up. A winter lasts a few weeks longer. Changes that seem almost insignificant could determine whether an entire community lived or died. That is why, for our ancestors, continuing to move was never an adventurous choice. It was a survival strategy. Anthropologists believe that the hunter-gatherer way of life demanded constant adaptation to the environment. When food sources changed, people had to change as well. When the climate shifted, they were forced to seek places better suited to survival. That extraordinary flexibility became one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. At first, that may sound completely ordinary, but compare us with countless other species. Many animals depend upon a very specific environment. If the forest disappears, they disappear with it. If their food source vanishes, their populations decline. Humans are different. We can learn. We can observe. We can remember. And perhaps most importantly, we can share what we have learned. One person discovers a better way to craft a spear point. The entire community benefits. One person learns which plants are safe to eat. That knowledge does not die with them. It is passed to their children, then to their grandchildren, and generation after generation. Across hundreds of generations, knowledge accumulated little by little, like drops of water slowly filling a great lake. That is a very special kind of evolution. Not the evolution of the body, but the evolution of culture. Perhaps that is humanity's true superpower. We are not stronger than bears. We are not faster than horses. We have no claws like lions, but we can learn from people we have never met. A child born today can benefit from knowledge accumulated across thousands of generations. Very few other species possess anything remotely comparable on such a scale. And it was that remarkable ability that transformed countless tiny footsteps into a journey spanning tens of thousands of years. The fascinating part is, when we look back at the entire story, it is easy to imagine that everything was leading toward one inevitable destination, as though history had already been written, as though humanity was destined to reach America. But science tells a different story. Current research suggests that human migration never unfolded according to a grand master plan. Instead, it emerged from countless small decisions made under very specific circumstances. No one knew what the final outcome would be. No one could see thousands of years into the future. One family decided to follow the herds. Another remained where they were for a few more seasons. One child grew up and chose another valley in which to build a camp. Those decisions seemed almost insignificant. Yet when repeated over hundreds of generations, they drew the map of humanity itself. Perhaps that is what makes this story feel so deeply personal. Because each of our lives today is also shaped by countless small decisions. A road you choose to take, a city you decide to move to, a career you begin, a person you happen to meet. No one knows where those choices will lead 10 years from now. Just like the first people who crossed Beringia, they had no idea an entire continent lay ahead, yet they kept walking. Not because they could see the future, but because they believed that somewhere ahead, there would always be another chance to survive. Perhaps that is what truly defines humanity. Not the ability to predict the future, but the courage to step into a future no one has ever seen. And when we look back at the journey into the Americas, we realize that the greatest miracle was never the land bridge, never the towering walls of ice, nor the thousands of kilometers that separated one world from another. The greatest miracle was humanity itself, a small, fragile species that never knew where it was going, yet possessed enough determination to keep walking toward the horizon. Today, when we look at a map of the world, we know exactly where Asia ends, where America begins, where the Bering Strait lies. We know things our ancestors never could. But perhaps, because we know so much, we sometimes forget what those very first footsteps truly felt like. Those people did not walk in search of a continent. They walked in search of tomorrow. None of them imagined that one day their descendants would live everywhere, from the frozen landscapes of Alaska to the rainforests of the Amazon and the plains of Patagonia. None of them imagined that tens of thousands of years later, scientists would use satellites, archaeology, geology, and DNA to retrace their footsteps. They simply did something profoundly human. When the path behind them became harder, they looked ahead and took one more step. Perhaps that is the single thread running through the entire story of humanity. From the hunters of Beringia to the sailors who crossed the oceans. From the first farmers who planted seeds to the astronauts who left Earth behind. Every generation has faced a horizon the generation before had never seen. And every generation has had to answer the same question. Do we have the courage to keep moving forward? Scientists believe that the story of humanity's first migration into the Americas will continue to be explored for many years to come. New archaeological discoveries, ancient DNA, and advancing technologies will almost certainly continue reshaping our understanding of that remarkable journey. But no matter how the final answers evolve, one truth seems destined to remain unchanged. America was not discovered by people who knew where they were going. It was reached by ordinary human beings. People who were simply trying to protect their families, follow the migrating herds, survive another winter, and who never stopped walking. Because sometimes, the greatest journeys in history do not begin with a map. They begin with nothing more than the belief that somewhere ahead, there is still a path waiting to be found.